Hi, everyone. So once again, thank you very much for joining us. Today is going to be an exploration of the four children. And really what we're looking to do here is to think about four children as four voices. Who is sat around our Seder table? What do they represent? And what are the voices that we are thinking of engaging with? Both internally, our own voices, and sifting through, for those who were on the call last week, our multi-generational selves. And also the selves of others who are sat around the table. And so today we're going to do a deep dive into thinking about models of educating ourselves and sharing that self-education with others around what it means to think broadly about the Seder from the perspective of the four children in the Haggadah.
And hi, it's Beth. And I just wanted to say welcome to everybody as well. I just want to acknowledge that there are a lot of people in this room and people from all over the world, it looks like. It's really quite remarkable. And people from lots of different backgrounds, Jewishly. I imagine there's also people who are not Jewish, but connected to the Jewish community. And like at the Seder, everyone is welcome. And I'm glad you're here. Last week, we started talking about storytelling and the importance of storytelling as leaving Egypt is the story, not being in Egypt. We acknowledge being in Egypt, but the story is really that we left Egypt. And I was thinking, we talk about Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim, remembering of leaving Egypt. We don't say Zecher Shahayinu b'Mitzrayim, that we were in Egypt. It's Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's memory of leaving Egypt. And so at the Seder, we sit around together and we talk about that. And today we're going to talk about the four children, which in my house is always where we get stopped. We get stopped because it's a very difficult text, complicated text, problematic text, I would say, but that's why we're going to talk about it. The four children, I think, is really about differentiated learning, what we today call differentiated learning, but maybe not best practices, what we would call it today, but we're going to grapple with it because when you grapple, you learn. And we're going to start with a blessing for studying Torah. And it's an interesting blessing. We're going to read, there's actually 3 blessings. We're going to read the first 1.5. It's on your source sheet, but it starts with, read it in Hebrew first. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, sovereign of the universe, who has made us holy through your commandments and commanded us to la'asok b'divrei Torah, to engage with, to absorb ourselves in, to struggle with, I would even say, words of Torah. It doesn't say to learn Torah. It's really about struggling. And then the next one says, V'harevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu u'b'fi kol amcha beit Yisrael. Make it sweet. Make these words sweet in our mouths and in the mouths of all your people, the house of Israel. The idea that these studies should be sweet, that we grapple with hard things in a sweet way. We're open to difficulties, just like we can be open to difficult people and learn from them. We're going to grapple with Torah in a way that hopefully we pray will be sweet. And I think I'm going to pass it over back to you, Rabbi, and let you take it from there.
La'asok b'divrei Torah. The words, to absorb ourselves, to engage, to involve ourselves. Like you said, it doesn't say lilmod.
Right.
That's another pasuk, right? To learn and to teach. But here it means to absorb. And in the laws of Hilchot Talmud Torah, Maimonides, and the laws of Torah study, the second verse says, let's read together, Lefichach amru chachamim. And this is why our sages of blessed memory said, Le'olam ya'asok adam b'Torah. A person should absorb themselves in Torah, afilu shelo lishma, even if not for its own sake. Shemitoch shelo lishma ba'lishma. For if we perform something that is not for its own sake, but maybe for an ulterior motive, then we end up doing it for its own sake. And for this, I want to hinge to another source, which sounds very similar, but is about Seder night. It's source 3. It's in the Tosefta. The Tosefta is a compendium of texts which accompany the Talmud, did not make its way into the canon. Here in Tosefta Pesachim, which is an addendum to Tractate Pesachim, we read, Chayav Adam la'asok behilchot haPesach kol halayla. A person must engage, again, absorb themselves in the laws of Pesach all night. Afilu beino leben beno, even if it is just them with their child. Afilu beino leben atzmo, even if they're talking with themselves. Afilu beino leben talmido, even if it's just them and their student. And I think that there's this tremendous parallel between this idea of la'asok b'divrei Torah, to absorb ourselves in Torah, and to absorb ourselves in Hilchot Pesach, in Seder, which is effectively to say that we are absorbing ourselves in a process. Maybe the texts themselves aren't speaking to us, or maybe they speak to us in certain ways. But if we can consider the experience itself as a container for engaging with others in a meaningful, deep, and compelling way, that very act of engaging, of absorbing ourselves in being fully present for that activity is the work itself. In other words, the container and the content are both companions to the experience, but let's not think that one is more important than the other. The act of showing up and being present, as we will see later, is really powerful. Of being fully present for conversation and dialogue is this la'asok. And so this, therefore, is what we referred to last time. I actually was, I said in error, it was from Pirkei Avot, from Ethics of Our Ancestors. The quote is actually from Mishlei. This is for Chanoch la'na'ar al pi darko, am ki yazkin lo yasur mimena. Educate a young person in the way appropriate for them, so that when they become older, they will not turn away from the teaching. And this is really to open up now between myself and Beth a conversation. But before I do that, I just want to refer to the frontispiece, which curiously comes from some years ago. Aleha HaShalom, Maureen Kendler, a teacher of Torah par excellence, who was one of the founders of Limud, which became, as we know, a global movement for learning. Maureen Kendler, whom used to lead experiences through the British Museum and through other museums in London. She once shared with me this piece, The Four Friends, which is a frontispiece by Henry Adlard, circa 1853. British Museum collection. The Four Friends are four figures who are lost to history. If you really want to know about them, you'll read source 5. But just when reading source 5, is this idea of sitting with friends and companions and losing track of time because you're in the conversation. 1853, 1855, right? This one print from the British Museum that kind of came to my life as like a kind of a fragment of someone else's memory. I offer this to you as a framing for what it might be to be with others year in, year out. Beth. What do you think about this idea of coming together as a sort of practice itself, that the coming together is itself a practice?
Right, it's a beautiful thing, especially if you talk about this idea that we come together. If you think about the four children and how different they are, and we kind of acknowledge, okay, we're not just bringing together people that we agree with, that think like us, that do, it's really about bringing together a diverse group of people and sitting together and learning from each other. And I'm going to go back to the blessing at the beginning. It says, make the words sweet in our mouths and in the mouths of the entire people. It's not just about me, right? If it's just sweet for me, that's not the essence. Redemption doesn't come just for me. It has to come, we didn't leave Egypt one person at a time. We left Egypt, yes, individuals, but we left Egypt together. And I imagine there were difficult people in that group too. People, and of course, who's difficult, right? Not me, only the other people. But I mean, that's the point. It's that idea that we engage, la'asok, we engage with each other, even when it's hard. Because we don't know the lishma part, for its own sake, eventually. God willing, if we do it in a way that's respectful and kind and curious, really curious, then something will come of it. We don't know what. You know, leaving Egypt, you don't know what, you end up in the desert. You don't know what's going to come, but you do it together. I think it's a beautiful concept. And I love that piece of art. Thank you for sharing that and the story with it.
James Montgomery, probably lost to history. I myself, didn't know very much about him, but there's a several volume memoirs of his life. And this last phrase of, so completely did their conversation absorb their attention that the fire had nearly died out for want of fuel and stirring. And some might recall the great story of the sages sitting in Bnei Barak, who were so involved in studying the laws of Pesach that they forgot to say the morning Shema until their children, their students, that was an interesting faux pas. Their students came in and said, "It's the morning light. You must do your duty and say the Shema." I think there's a tremendous parallel across almost two millennia between those two stories. I just thought it was very curious.
Well, isn't that what happens when we study together? I mean, really study with curiosity. We don't look at our watches, and it's time beyond time. That's Olam Haba time. That's world to come time. We access it when we're really in a curious, honest relationship with other people together. So should we delve into these 4 children?
Yes, absolutely. For those following in the text, it's source 6, engaging with the world of the 4 children. And we're not going to do the whole text together inside. Really, for those following, this is the primary text that we are referring to. This is the text that illustrates the 4 children, the 4 voices, and the responses of our educator self to these 4 voices. It is the wise son, the Chacham, Echad Chacham, Echad Rasha, and here a wicked son or a rebellious child, Echad Tam, and an innocent child. Just the translations themselves. I mean, so many Haggadot have different translations. Echad she'eino Yode'ah Li'shol, and the child who is absent a question, who doesn't know how to ask a question. And we're really going to focus on the first 2 in our conversation between us, the wise and the rebellious voices here, and refer to the other 2 by virtue of that conversation. So for those following, this is the text, and we're going to start with the wise son, otherwise this archetype of the person who is interested in the minutiae, apparently the details of the story of Pesach. So there are actually other texts, several other texts that are extant contemporaneously with the Haggadah, and 2 actually predate the Haggadah. And so if we turn to source 7, the Mechilta, which is a very early source, around the 3rd century of the Common Era, is the earliest text which has the 4 children in it. And we have included the first. And it just, by the way, if you can, to mute yourselves when you're on the call, so that way people are still able to connect. So here is the text in the Mechilta. It turns out that Torah, and I'm doing it in English, it turns out that Torah has 4 children. Here it's son, so we're going to use son because it says it in the text. A smart son, a Chacham, ve'echad tipesh, and a stupid son, tipesh is stupid, echad Rasha, a wicked son, ve'echad she'eino Yode'ah Li'shol, and one who does not know to ask. The Chacham, what does a Chacham say? Ma ha'edut v'hachokim. Great. What are the testimonies and the statutes? And that is the reference that we have in our text. And we respond, as we respond in our text, you shall not eat the Paschal lamb, but you should not follow the Paschal lamb with reveling or with dessert. Afikoman, epikuron was actually the after party in ancient Greece. So for those who want to know what that piece of matzah represents, it actually represents the after party when you go jovially to other people's homes and gate crash their Sederim. So that's what apikoman actually means in Greek. I wouldn't recommend doing it though. People probably wouldn't enjoy that. and certainly not at this time, sadly. But the Talmud Yerushalmi has a very different view. Look at this, source 8. Tanya Rabbi Chia taught, Keneged Arba Banim Dibra Torah, and then it has the same construction. There are reference to 4 children. Ben Chacham Mahu Omer, same question, what does a wise son say? And then the response is completely different. The response in the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud says, Af ata emolo b'chozik yad hotzianu mitzrayim beit avadim. With a powerful hand, God took us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. So our problem is that we have 2 texts that predate a Haggadah, where the response to the Chacham is different. One is responding with minutiae, and the other is responding with a grand story. And the question is, which is more compelling for us? The grand story, the themes of slavery, or the way in which we carry out this ritual, the granular way in which we contain this experience through doing various things that make our experience linear, clear, and accordance with the laws of Passover. Beth, what do you think?
Well, it's interesting. It's a real question. What is a wise person? Someone who knows the details, or someone who knows the grand story? And, you know, it could almost be in the second one. And by the way, that second answer, the grand story answer, that's the answer in our Haggadah that you give to the Tom, to the simple son. So it's almost like these answers we have in our Haggadah as if this is how you answer these people. This is the answer. This is the curriculum. But in fact, what we're seeing here is that there's a unique answer for each person depending on where they're coming from. So we've talked about this. You know, we've seen texts where this answer about the grand story is a way of saying to the wise child, you know, you're caught up in all the details. You're missing the grand picture. And it's almost a rebuke. You know, everyone wants to be the wise child, right? But maybe the wise child is just saying to, you know, don't think you're so great. Be part of us. You know, any thoughts? What are you thinking?
I'm struck between, and maybe we'll you know, we can open it up to some comments from our group, which is, I'm struck here by, you know, why the wise child gets the opening call. You know, what is it about that? I wonder whether it's Talmudic culture and our interest in the lamdan, right? The one who in yeshiva, you know, the one who asks a grosse kasha, the one who asks a question that floors the teacher, and the teacher is overjoyed by the fact that they can't answer this question from the student. And I'm almost imagining as if there's some kind of like a cheshek halimud. There's this kind of like a reflection on rabbinic Talmudic culture. I'm thinking of Daniel Bayarin here also, on the Talmudic culture of being floored by a question, you know, and that back and forth, the joy of being asked a question which one has to kind of pivot into a different answer. Yeah, that's lovely. What's coming up for me.
Well, yes, and the beautiful thing about this is this could be a way of saying we're honoring the wise child, or it could be a way of saying this wise child is just jumps in and doesn't give other people space first, right? So the afikomen, if it's saying like don't go reveling at other people's parties now, maybe it's saying, you know, you sat through the beginning of the Seder with this group, you know, this diverse group. Not everybody's brilliant like you. Don't now go think you can run off, you know, during you were in slavery with everybody. You get redeemed with everybody afterwards. Yes, we sing songs, we stay together, but we stick with the same people. We don't abandon them at that point. And then the Chacham, the wise one, might say, you know, I just want to go be with my people. This is like too slow for me. And they said, no, you're part of this. You're part of the grand story. Or we could read it completely differently, as the Chacham, the wise person, is the model. I guess it depends on who we are and how we feel about the wise person. We're going to take our own view and how we feel about ourselves and our own wisdom, and how comfortable we are with what we know and don't know.
Maybe the wise child is the one you judge capable of doing the kind of memorization work that it took to transmit all of this information.
Right. Without that, we wouldn't have it still.
The Rasha. Okay. I know that we disagree about this one. So
Okay, we'll jump into the Rasha. Okay.
Should we get to
We'll
it?
jump into the Rasha. Okay. The Rasha is the I love that you translate this, the willful disruption. That's although we always try to get around that word Rasha, like maybe there's something that's not quite as harsh as it is, but it's a harsh word. There's no translation that can get us out of it. Rasha is evil, and it's not something that we think is a good thing. So I'm going to go back to text number 6 and just look at what our Haggadah says. Text number 6 is our Haggadah. So if you don't have this text in front of you, but you have a Haggadah, it's the same thing, right? And the Rasha Mahu Omer, what's the Rasha, this says wicked one. When he says, what is a service to you? He refers to you rather than to himself. Because he excludes himself from the group, Lefisha hotzi et atzmo min haklal, and rejects a fundamental principle, kafar be'ikar, whatever that means. This is an interesting conversation. What does it mean to exclude ourselves? What does it mean to exclude oneself? What's the fundamental principle? You must set his teeth on edge. Again, what does that mean? It seems to be a sort of punishment. And then you say to him, it is because of what Adonai did for me when I left Egypt. By the way, that's the exact same verse that we say, that we give to the one who doesn't know how to ask. You don't see that in the English. The English is translated differently, but it's the same verse. And then you say, you refer to yourself, to me, rather than to him. In other words, li v'lo lo. It happened to me and not to him. That would be a more literal translation. It happened to me and not to him. And if he'd been there, well, this is interesting. I don't like the translation. I'm going to give my own translation. Li v'lo lo. To me and not to him. Ilu hayasham lo haya nigal. If he'd been there, he wouldn't have been redeemed. And I want to point out that it doesn't say you and not me. I mean, me and not you. I read this as him saying to himself, the parent saying, it happened to me and not to my child. If my child had been there, my child would not have been redeemed. Because something is sadness. This child doesn't see this child's self as part of the community. At least that's the read here, the simple read. At least what I think is a simple read. So let's look at text number 9, because this is a variation, as we saw before with the wise child. There's more than one text. What does a wicked son say? What is this service to you? Which is what we have in our text. But then it adds, what is this bother that you bother us with every year? What's this tircha? Like, why are you making me do all this stuff? Since he removed himself from the group, you should also tell him, because of that which God did for me. He did it for me. For that guy, he did not do it. If that guy were in Egypt, if he'd been there, he would not have been fit to be redeemed. It takes out the teeth blunting, but it adds a little bit more of negativity on the terms of the Rasha. So I want to, what do we do with this? I want to share a text, number 10. This is from the Pizetzner Rebbe. He was the Hasidic Rebbe in the Warsaw Ghetto. He was killed in the Holocaust, and his writings were found afterwards. Fascinating person and a beautiful, beautiful teacher. And I'm just taking a small part of how he deals with the wicked child. First of all, he notes that the answer to the wicked child is the same on some level, the same verse at least, that is given to the one who does not know to ask. And then he says, it's obvious that the Torah never intended for even the wicked son to be excluded. I think that he thinks, it's fascinating that he says it's obvious, because it's not always obvious to us. But to him, it's obvious this child is also part of the community. It's a scriptural commandment to help all kinds of children, to turn around and draw close to the Torah. That's what we're supposed to do. Even the wicked child, of that child, it's not said, do not answer the fool. In other words, you could say, if he asks you these questions, don't even answer him. It's no. On the contrary, with regard to the commandment to teach Torah to our children, all children will respond and draw close. And then he says, and this is, what do you do with this blunt the teeth? He says, the first part of the commandment to blunt his teeth has already been sufficiently fulfilled amongst us. We've already felt punished enough, all of us. And I would say, especially the child who does not feel part of the community, that's punishment enough. You don't have to add. What remains is for God, the Blessed One, to draw us close to God with mercy. And then here's the, bats at home. The very next thing in Haggadah we have is that this verse, originally our ancestors were idol worshippers, but now the omnipresent has brought us near to God's service. That's in the Haggadah, right, the very next thing. And the Pizetzner tells us the Haggadah is telling us this has always been the case. There's always been people, even our ancestors, we've always been far away. We were all far away, and even so, the omnipresent brought us close to serve God. In other words, don't other the Rasha. You might think this person's a Rasha. You might think this person is evil. That's your projection. What do you think? What are you thinking? Is there such a thing as a Rasha?
I'm thinking that I'm very challenged, and maybe others will join me in being so challenged as to the response to someone who shows up and engages. This idea of conversation that is confronting, is something that we all have to deal with. Some conversations are confronting. Yeah. But the Rasha, whoever the Rasha is around the table, is present in the room, is engaging. Even if they're engaging in such a way that is confronting for us, they're present and they're engaging. And if I'm reading Hakeh Shinav is to defang the Rasha, that's what we're doing. We're defanging the Rasha of the bite. Then there's a bite. Then our response shows there is something going on there that is pushing us in a certain way, or pushing the voice of the Haggadah. And what do we come out with? What we come out with is, we're in and you're out. We're othering the Rasha, or we're othering that voice. I think that is tremendously difficult and challenging for educators. This idea that there could be a voice in the room that is othered by them. And I would say, what I've brought here is at the very bottom is that great other Rebbe, Morris Sendak, in Where the Wild Things Are. Morris Sendak's autobiography is tragic. He was gay, never shared it until much later in his life, carried that identity with him all his life. And the very opening of Where the Wild Things Are, I think, speaks to a psychobiography of Max Sendak himself, where it says, the night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind of another, his mother called him Wilde Chaya, which is what wild thing is in Yiddish. And if you look online and you see that in an interview, that's what wild thing is. He was actually called Wilde Chaya by his aunts when he was growing up, and that's where the wild thing came from. And then Max, continuing to act out, is sent to bed without eating anything. We often refer to these fairy tales, but Bruno Bettelheim, talks about the enchantments of our youth. And I think that our earliest memories of conversations can often be tremendously formative of later experiences. And so what I'm wondering is, at what stage in the development of themselves as a person is the Rasha sharing this? They're still in the room. What happens 5 years later, 10 years later? Are they still there after having come every time to say, hello, I'm here. Are you looking at me? Are you seeing me for me? I'm not feeling connected here. Connect me. I think that's how I'm reading the Eish Kodesh partly. Connect me.
Right.
Is that?
Absolutely. I think the Eish Kodesh is the same as the Pizetzner Rebbe is also known as the Eish Kodesh. He's leading with compassion. He's reminding us, if somebody is not feeling part of the group, that's our problem. Like, who decides this is the Rasha? I think the language you used when we were studying before is it's a projection of the community. Who's a Rasha? What does it mean to kafar bi'ikar? What does it mean to reject that, the fundamental principle? What is, I think this is a really important question for our time. Who do we decide in the room? Who do we decide who's the Rasha? Maybe this text is here to confront us with the fact that we use this language and we need to be careful about it. It's I don't know, I'm curious to hear maybe from the community
If you'd like, Beth, I can go ahead and bring in a couple comments from the
Sure.
chat box now.
Great.
I've seen a few really amazing ones, so I apologize that I can't get to everyone, but one that really struck me was Jude sharing, the wicked is often the one who returns or acts most strongly after they resolve their issues and problems with the community. And we also have one here from C. Garcia that says, let's ponder on why children, these four adults, all too within each of us today, as well as each child within us, brings forth our distinctive voice and perspective, diverse as the time of day, as well as the facets of who we are, depending on the life circumstance.
Second comment, Cezanne, that's just beautiful. I don't think there's more to say than what you said. It's just beautiful. And I also want to note that yes, we always used to joke when I used to teach Hebrew school for many years that the kid who was the most difficult kid in your Hebrew school class was the one who was going to become the rabbi. That was always, that was because they weren't or at least involved in the community in the long run. If we accepted their questions and we let them engage with their questions, because those are the ones who are the most challenging to the teacher, only if the teacher is not secure enough to see that these are real questions. I mean, a spiritual life is not an easy thing. Doubt is one of the greatest signs of a true spiritual life. And as Cezanne, as you said, different times in your life, you have different, we play these different roles. And I think, as we'll see at the end, I'll share something at the end, but these are all parts of all of us.
One more comment, and then I think we can jump back in. And this one from my lovely lady, Kara Abrams. She shared, amazing that the Eish Kodesh could say this while he was in the Shoah.
I think what is very interesting about Eish Kodesh is that when you read his writings, there is often the Shoah is almost absent, actually. Direct reference to the Shoah. The Eish Kodesh lost several members of his family to bombing, including his son, to bombing in the ghetto in very quick succession, and suffered intense personal bereavement. And yet, when you read the Eish Kodesh from the writings that have come to us, we don't see any direct reference to any of the calamities that befell him. It's almost like they got folded in to his reflections more generally and went into the substrate of his unconscious when he was writing. So what is powerful about the Eish Kodesh is that the Shoah only obliquely is mentioned in his writings. Isn't it, Beth? Isn't that the case?
Yeah, he never mentions, the word Nazis and the word Germany doesn't show up. He'll say in our times, he'll say our sufferings, he'll say that. He'll certainly refer to it. But he never mentioned the exact circumstance. Although, I can only study a little bit of him at a time, because it's knowing where he was and knowing who he's speaking to and knowing his own life story it just opens up such heartbreak, but also such deep compassion for all Jews. He doesn't say to anybody who's struggling to have faith, he says, take care of somebody. Take care of somebody. That's how he understood that you survive if you're taken care of, if you're needed. And that's ultimately the greatest teaching that one could have. And maybe that's what part of this is Rasha. Rasha, we need to let every child know they're needed. And not just children. These children, by the way, are metaphors for all of us. We're all children. We're all children. And we all need a place at the table. We all need, like the wild thing, like Max, still want to have dinner. We still want the soup that mom made.
He still gets the soup at the end.
Yeah.
That's what he wants. He wants the soup. He wants
We all want the soup at the end, right? Yeah. Should we move on to the next next child?
Yes. Let's. And really, this is Lezecha Neshmat Michael Rosenack, Alav Hashalom, Michael Rosenack, a professor of education at Hebrew University. Some of you may have heard of him. So Michael wrote a book called The Tree of Life, which was on pedagogy and education, and was a teacher's teacher in many respects. And he was very attached to this idea of tamimut, as naivete, not as innocence, but as naivete and even second naivete, which was the idea that when we are younger and we have a certain narrative of the religious life or the communal life, that narrative is either confronted by our texts needing to be read in the light of academic light that is shed on where these texts came from, and we are confronted by the commandedness of our texts, or it's that there are certain rituals that seem fantastical to the adult mind and feel like they are of the child's landscape and not really speaking to their adult self. And he claims, quoting a philosopher called Paul Ricoeur, that there's this idea of a second naivete. And here Eli Holzer, who currently teaches across the country in many programs of education. So he's referring now to this ben tipesh, this idea of how can one even say the word now, stupid child or stupid son? We don't use that language. That's not language that we use as educators. We're all taught to understand that there is differentiation in the classroom and that the onus is on the teacher educator to facilitate for various different learning styles. And so when we read from medieval texts like David Abudaram of Seville, that there's this idea of asking questions and asking in a deep way, and that really is a question of how the Tum asks their question. We're confronted by that. And so Eli Holzer, responding to this medieval idea of hierarchies of question, that there's hierarchies of intellect, says, no, not at all. That's not the way. Let's read together. Source 13. This is Eli Holzer writing an essay in memory of, in honor of Michael Rosenack. First, naivete signifies a person's simplistic connection with and acceptance of the symbolic mythic foundations of the surrounding culture. In other words, Shabbat happens and I keep Shabbat because that is what my parents do, that is what my culture does. They are symbols that speak to me as a child. But then I grow up and then I get critical distance from those tropes. Critical distance signifies the reader's use of various interpretive approaches which create a distance from mythic symbol systems. In other words, I see now this world of the symbol, but I have a critical distance. And so I can choose, I have agency as to whether to enter into that world or to remove myself from it. I can keep Shabbat, or I can decide not to keep Shabbat. I can keep kosher or decide not to keep kosher. Why? Because I have agency and critical distance. The symbols don't have that psychological hold on me like they might have done if I grew up in an environment where everyone, including authority figures, was practicing these symbols. And then he says, second naivete is a term used by Ricoeur to capture the core idea of his philosophical project, which is a person's interpretive stance informed by the use of critical models, but now open to the depths of symbolic meaning. When I come to the Seder table, that moment of matzah, the moment that the matzah breaks, is the moment in which I am making memory, making memory in my family, in my community, and I'm tethered to memory making across millennia. I eat the matzah in silence, possibly, not because I'm commanded to do it, but because I enter into the as if, we mentioned this last week, the world of Ki'ilu. I inhabit the mythical, I inhabit the symbolic, I enter into it, I willingly wear the robes of mythos because it compels me into a culture and tradition that speaks across time. Egypt, as we were saying last week, is not a place, it's a condition. And it's one that reverberates across the space-time continuum in Jewish text and life. And so This idea of second naivety I find so compelling, just so compelling. What do you think?
I love it. I mean, it's my teacher. Well, Michael Rosenack was also my teacher, and Zichrono Livracha, and spectacular teacher. And a teacher of mine now, Melila Helmer Eshed, she talks about sacred imagination. Like this idea, I don't think it's hers, but she talks about it. You have to be able to enter into that place of imagination that's sacred. It's not a childhood thing. It's actually a sign of maturity that we have that second naivete, that we can enter into it and not be afraid of it and not think it's childish. It's actually profound if we can embrace it and see it for what it is. And this child, to put this child in that light, it's beautiful. Thank you.
Just because we're talking about Pesach and the fact that it's an offering, it's a sacrifice, the original word of in Leviticus and Vayikra of tamimut refers to a whole offering.
Yeah.
And the converse of it is nituach, that deconstructing or dismembering a sacrifice and then reconstituting as a whole is a practice. Is that the deconstruction of our narratives is a necessary part of the evolution of a religious self, which, as James Fowler claims in a book that I wish that I would have read when I was a bit younger. It came out in 1976. I could have read it, but I was given a little bit on the late side, but thank you to whoever gave it to me, is that there's the evolution of the religious consciousness, and it includes the rebellious stage. Like whether we act it out or not, it absolutely must include it in order to be robust. And that second naivete is an evolution of that consciousness, dismembering or deconstructing something in order to make it whole again at the end. I just find that very compelling.
Well, that's what we all need to do in order to grow up, religious or not. I mean, this is, we forget that that's part of what it means to be an honest religious, a spiritual person. You have to take it apart, put it back together. Just like every other part of our lives, we have to take apart and put back together.
I do want to clarify, though, if I may, that this is not to suggest that post-traumatic God syndrome is a useful paradigm, and that we can be traumatized by our Judaism. But I do not. I often believe now, having had so many educators that have powerfully impacted my life positively, that it is the delivery, it is the conduit, it is the educator self by which we receive this wisdom and these teachings that from which we draw chiyut, nourishment.
So Deirdre Gabai has said, I love this. I think many people are coming to this, not just within Judaism. People who have not been steeped from birth in the need for connection to symbolism from past and tradition are finding on their own based on their needs, it seems. And then we have a comment here from Susan. Do you have to have childhood memories of something in order to come back to it?
Well, yes. And I think everybody has childhood memories of some kind or another, right? That's the question is, what are they? What do we do with them? How are they treated? How were they experienced? Who was my teacher along the way, no matter what those experiences were? I'm assuming, like, I'm very aware that not everybody has childhood Jewish memories who are Jewish today, and yet those childhood memories are also still crucial. They're spiritual memories. We all have spiritual experiences. All right, so the fourth child, this text from Adam Phillips, I'm just going to read it out loud because the child absent a question, and the bored child, a sprawl of absent possibilities, is looking for something to hold his attention. He's like a man who walks as quickly as possible through a gallery until a picture actually arrests his attention, until he is stopped. And at that point, we might add, the transference is taken. Like, the child wasn't bored. The child just needed something to catch the child's attention. with a child to be allowed to have what Winnicott calls the full course of the experience, the child needs the use of an environment that will suggest things without imposing them, not preempt the actuality of the child's desire by force feeding. The child, absent a question, I've seen this as a teacher, there'll be people who will sit in the class and they don't say a word. They're taking it in, and they're ready to take in whatever, the thing that will hit them. And I never know what it's gonna be. And they might not say anything, but at one point they'll stop. And there it is. And it's not the thing I thought it was gonna be, it's not the thing I intended for it to be, but it was the right thing for that child. And I know from I've experienced it myself.
Yeah, I guess, again, you know, the idea of walking through, I mentioned last week, through a gallery, right? Like, you know, just being completely overwhelmed. I came across another text. We're not going to go through all of these texts. They're just too many, but we added them because we thought they could be good, juicy material from which to discuss your Seder, but 16. The curator of Jewish experience. This came to me like last year. I'd never seen a job title. A curator of Jewish experience. It exists. It exists at Stanford University Hillel. It is the only one of its kind, I think, in the world. I don't know any other Hillel that has a curator of Jewish experience. I think it's a phenomenal role. Maybe people can fact check me here. But this title, it's not a rabbi. It's not an expert in the room. It is not someone who is bringing authority to themselves. If you just look at the description of this role, I think that it says it all. To help people live lives of meaning, to facilitate that meaning. And for me, the bored child is a child with as much potential as any other. I think I saw, you know, a question about dementia or about, you know, those who have different learning styles. I think that there's an opportunity for any educator self to say, what is the medium through which I'm communicating here, and to pivot and adjust. And so I'm just taken by this idea of curating experience, and that the Seder is like a gallery in which we, you know, can offer different opportunities for catchiness, for grabbiness. Right. Something grabs you, right? What grabs you? And there's a sort of whole palette of different colors that can pull you in. So, you know, for me, that is really where I'm coming from. The imagination, exactly that is that palette. Are you an Imagineer, a Jewish Imagineer?
Right. Well, I think that's what I think. This title, Curator of Jewish Experience, is their way of saying this is actually what a teacher is. A true teacher, right? In other words, I read this and I think, yeah, that's what every program director should be in some way, right? Like how, but they're putting into the title. Sometimes we need to change the language in order to remind ourselves of what we're really supposed to be doing. This is not about me telling students, if I'm working at a Hillel or wherever I happen to, telling them what they need. That never should have been the job. And they had to mix the title up in order to remind all of us. And I think that's something that's happening now in the Jewish community at large, is that people are playing with language. You know, I'm old, but I see what the next generation is doing with language, and it's inspiring. They're shaking it up. They're saying, and I'm recognizing what they're talking about. It needs to be translated for me, but it's like, yeah, exactly. You're saying what I've been trying to say, but you found the language. And I'm grateful to. We got to keep playing with language. It's all about language. That's the telling. That's why we have to keep telling again and again, and the telling will change. And the words will change. And as we change the words, we'll experience it differently. Let me just go to the last child, because then we can wrap up. From the Lubavitcher Rebbe, just a reminder that, you know, we've been talking about the people that are at the table. And there is a fifth child, and that's the one who's not there. And it's something we have to keep in mind. It's part of the story. That child's also part of the story, and we can get really caught up in who's in the room and why this one is good and that one's bad, and this one's in the group and that one's out of the group. But what about the one who doesn't even show up? And we have to keep that. in mind, and I'm going to just pivot quickly to text number 21, which is a picture, and I'm just going to do this very, very quickly, but this is an artistic rendition of the four children from David Moss. And there's so much to say about this. We could spend a whole hour on this one, but I just want to point out that the word Baruch, blessed, there's right before the four children, there's a section that says, has the word, it talks about God is blessed 4 times. And he takes the word Baruch and he puts it 4 times, he puts it over the 4 children. And what he's saying is, every child is a blessing. That's his message. It doesn't matter who it is. Every child is a blessing. And he calls this the blessing of diversity. He says, at our Haggadah, at our Seder, we have diversity. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, can we embrace it? That is what's going to, the measure of our community is whether we can embrace all these children, maybe without labels. And that goes to the next, number 23. This is from the Rabbinical Assembly Haggadah. This is a drawing of the 4 children, and notice that each child is represented by a different color, but each person has all the colors within them. And perhaps that's the message. Don't think you're this one or you're that one. We're all, I think Cezanne said this earlier, we're all part of all these children. And I want to repeat that it's not about children at a certain age. We're all children. We're always children till the day we die, we're children. That's what I think this is about. I'm going to pass the baton back to you and want to let you wrap it up here.
Discomfort is inherent to diversity. This is a quote. Being able to sit with the discomfort brought on by engagement with the other implies a deep and mature diversity. And this is an article that appeared actually in the South African Jewish Report, which references at the beginning Maureen Kendler, and it's really in her, her honor and in her memory that I share this. Maureen Kendler was a teacher's teacher, and she taught this by being her own example of what this meant. She was a huge presence in my life as a teenager. I mourn that she is no longer with us, and she has a tremendous impact on many. And she taught that attitudinally, that discomfort is an opportunity. That when as an educator you are discomforted by something, there's an opportunity to engage. And for those that want to read this article, I really recommend it. Source 24, it's online. It really digs into the Mos Haggadah, brings out the flavor of what Beth was referring to as a blessing of diversity, and speaks to the idea of being the kind of person that welcomes that engagement and around a table. And so for me, a fundamental response, it's not an answer, is how do we respond, right? How do we respond to these voices? Whether it's internally in ourselves, the committee that heads and tells us that we're not enough, or that tells us that, we're not sufficient in this way or that way, we're a good Jew or a bad Jew, or, we're not Jewish enough. I think that it's actually the committee that we need to in the 4 aspects in each of us. And as for my thinking around what Maureen did, Maureen managed to bring people around our table in such a way as to recognize them all and say, I see you for who you are. I think that is a tremendous gift when someone can do that and stay present. And so, really, this was her way to welcome the blessing of diversity.
And maybe that's what the 4 children are there, to make us uncomfortable in the fact that we don't always do that. And the text makes us uncomfortable. And that's maybe how we should be feeling when we read this text.
Wow. I don't know about all of you in your homes, but I am certainly feeling very inspired, both by the conversation that we had here today and by the incredible comments that were in the chat box, which I'm sure Beth and Rabbi Samuel are going to be so curious to read and get to wrestle with. We are doing this as part of a 3-part series. Beth, can you talk a little bit about the 6-word story before we go out?
Sure. Last week I suggested that we should, to get to the essence of a story and try to put it into 6 words. And the idea is to write a story of leaving Egypt, a personal narrow place, something that's either a story that has inspired you. There's this idea of an intergenerational self that gives us resiliency because we know the stories of our family or people that we have been influenced us, or our own stories of getting through hard times. So, and telling those stories and hearing those stories is what helps build resiliency for children and for adults as well. So the challenge was to write a story in 6 words of leaving Egypt, of getting through a hard time, of resiliency, either in your life, the life of somebody in your family, a teacher, somebody who influenced you, that helps you remember that, bad times can be overcome. It's not about being in Egypt. It's not about words to live by, wisdom to live by. It's a real story that's true to you, that reminds you that it is possible to overcome hard times. So if you want to share with us a story like that, just 6 words. It's really an interesting thing to try to do. I've done it, and it really helped me get to the essence of some important stories in my family.
Wow. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We are at our time. We have shared a link to the source sheet and to the also to the survey if you want to complete the 6-word story. And there was a question about Limud E-Festival. Here is a link in the chat box for anybody who's interested. It's this Sunday. Thank you all for joining us. So powerful, so glad to have you, and onward.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, everyone.